controversy. Chaka Khan, the queen of funk herself, settled into her chair with the grace and poise that had carried her through decades in the music industry. Her presence commanded attention even in silence, the kind of magnetic energy that reminded everyone in the room why she had earned her legendary status. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, her notes scattered across the table in front of her, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There was something in her demeanor that morning, an edge that the production crew had noticed during the pre-show briefing. She had been unusually focused on certain talking points, circling back to them repeatedly during their preparation. "So, Chaka," Joy began, her voice carrying that familiar tone that viewers had come to know so well. "You've been in this business for what, 5 decades now? That's incredible longevity, especially for someone who started so young." Chaka nodded graciously, her hands folded in her lap. "Thank you, Joy. Yes, it's been quite a journey. I feel blessed to still be here, still be performing, still connecting with audiences after all these years. And through all those years, you've seen the industry change dramatically." Joy continued, her pen tapping against her notes. "The music business today versus when you started with Rufus, it's like 2 completely different worlds, isn't it?" "Absolutely," Chaka agreed, warming to the topic. "When we started, it was all about the music, the artistry. Labels would invest in developing artists, give them time to grow, to find their voice. Today, everything moves so fast. Social media, streaming, instant gratification." Joy's expression shifted slightly, a subtle change that Chaka caught but couldn't quite interpret. "Speaking of finding your voice, you've always been known for speaking your mind, haven't you? Some might say you've been quite outspoken about certain issues over the years." There was something in the way Joy emphasized the word outspoken that made Chaka straighten slightly in her chair. She had been through enough interviews to recognize when a conversation was about to take a turn. "I've always believed in being authentic," Chaka replied carefully. "If you stand for something, you should be willing to speak about it. That doesn't mean being confrontational. It means being honest about your values and experiences." Joy flipped through her notes with deliberate slowness, letting the silence stretch just long enough to create tension. "Honest, yes. But sometimes honesty can come across as, well, difficult to work with. There have been stories over the years, haven't there, about your, let's say, perfectionist tendencies?" The shift in the room's energy was palpable. The cameras continued rolling, but the production staff exchanged glances. This wasn't the direction they had discussed in the pre-interview. Chaka's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think there's a difference between having standards and being difficult, Joy. When you've been doing something at a high level for as long as I have, you develop certain expectations for professionalism and quality." Of course," Joy said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "But surely you can understand how some people might interpret that. I mean, there was that incident in the 80s with the backup singers, and then the producer in the 90s who said working with you was like walking on eggshells." Chaka's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the queen of funk's legendary fire was visible. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to get at here, but I think you might be confusing having professional standards with being unreasonable. Those situations you're referencing, if you knew the full context, you might understand why I made the choices I did." Joy leaned back in her chair, a satisfied look crossing her face as if she had gotten exactly the reaction she was hoping for. "Oh, I'm not trying to get at anything, Chaka. I'm just curious about how you handle criticism. Because in this business, especially for women of a certain age, there's always going to be people questioning whether you're still relevant, whether your time has passed." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. Chaka's hand gripped the arm of her chair slightly tighter, and her voice, when she spoke, carried a note of warning that anyone familiar with her music would have recognized. "Women of a certain age?" she repeated, her tone deceptively calm. "Joy, I'm wondering if you would ask a male artist the same question. Would you ask Mick Jagger if his time has passed? Would you question Paul McCartney's relevance?" Joy waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, that's different. Rock stars have a different kind of staying power. The music industry has always been tougher on female artists, especially in genres like funk and R&B. You have to admit that." "I don't have to admit anything," Chaka replied, her voice growing stronger. "What I will say is that if you invited me here to discuss my career and my new projects, then let's do that. If you brought me here to psychoanalyze my personality or question my relevance, then maybe we should have had a different conversation before the cameras started rolling. The tension in the studio was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Joy's co-hosts shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about how to navigate this unexpected confrontation. The production crew watched nervously from behind the cameras, wondering if they should intervene. Joy, however, seemed energized by the conflict rather than deterred by it. Chaka, I think you're being a little oversensitive here. This is just normal interview conversation. We ask tough questions, that's what we do. Our viewers expect that from us. Tough questions? Chaka's voice rose slightly, her legendary control beginning to show cracks. There's a difference between tough questions and disrespectful insinuations, Joy. You've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes, essentially calling me difficult and irrelevant, and when I push back, you tell me I'm being oversensitive? The camera operators continued filming, knowing they were capturing something that would be talked about for years to come. Joy's expression had shifted from satisfied to slightly defensive, but she wasn't backing down. I never called you irrelevant, Joy protested. I'm just pointing out realities of the industry. Look, Chaka, you're a legend. Everyone knows that. But legends don't become legends by avoiding difficult conversations or getting upset when people ask challenging questions. Chaka stood up abruptly, her chair rolling back slightly. The sudden movement caused everyone in the studio to freeze. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the television equipment and the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Chaka Khan stood behind her chair, her hands resting on the back of it, looking down at Joy Behar with an expression that could have melted steel. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. You know what, Joy? Chaka said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her decades in the music industry. I've sat through a lot of interviews in my time. I've answered questions about my personal life, my struggles, my triumphs, my failures. I've been respectful even when the questions weren't particularly respectful. But what you're doing here isn't journalism. It's not even good television. It's just mean-spirited. Joy's face flushed slightly, but her defiance remained intact. Chaka, please sit down. You're being dramatic. This is how interviews work. We have conversations. Sometimes they get a little heated, but that's what makes good television. Our audience loves when things get real. Real? Chaka laughed, but there was no humor in it. What's real is that you've spent the last 15 minutes trying to paint me as some kind of diva prima donna who's past her prime. What's real is that you've twisted every question to make me look bad. What's real is that you're using my presence on your show to create drama instead of actually celebrating the music and the career that got me here. One of Joy's co-hosts finally tried to intervene. Maybe we could, shift gears here and talk about Chaka's new album. But Joy wasn't ready to let it go. She turned to her colleague with barely concealed irritation. No, this is important. Chaka's raising an interesting point about how we conduct interviews. But Chaka, you have to understand, we can't just throw softball questions at every guest who comes on. Our viewers are smart. They want substance. Chaka slowly walked around to the front of her chair, never breaking eye contact with Joy. Substance? You want to talk about substance? Let's talk about the fact that I've sold over 70 million records worldwide. Let's talk about my 10 Grammy Awards. Let's talk about being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once as a solo artist and once with Rufus. Let's talk about influencing generations of singers who came after me. That's substance, Joy. And that's all wonderful, Joy replied, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made everyone in the room cringe. But success doesn't make you immune from criticism or difficult questions. In fact, I would argue that your success means you should be able to handle this kind of scrutiny with more grace. The word grace seemed to hit Chaka like a physical blow. Her eyes narrowed. And when she spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. Grace? You want to talk to me about grace? I've shown you nothing but grace since I walked into this studio. I've answered your questions politely even as they became increasingly disrespectful. I've maintained my composure while you've systematically tried to tear me down on national television, and now you're going to lecture me about grace? Joy shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was heading, but still unwilling to back down. "Look, Chaka, I think you're taking this way too personally. This is just how television works. We ask the questions that viewers are thinking but might be too polite to ask themselves." "No, Joy," Chaka said, stepping closer to the table. "This is how your television works. This is how you operate. You invite guests on, you pretend you're going to have a nice conversation about their work, and then you ambush them with personal attacks disguised as journalism. You create conflict where none needs to exist because you think it makes for better ratings." The production crew was frantically trying to signal to the director about whether they should cut to commercial, but the director waved them off. This was television gold, controversial but compelling, exactly the kind of content that would be replayed and analyzed for months. Joy's voice rose defensively. "I'm not ambushing anyone. These are legitimate questions about your career and your reputation in the industry. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, then maybe you shouldn't be doing publicity tours." "There it is," Chaka said, pointing at Joy with a perfectly manicured finger. "There's the real Joy Behar. When your tactics don't work, when your guest doesn't crumble under your attacks, you blame them for not being able to handle it. You make it their fault for having the audacity to push back against your disrespect." Joy stood up now too, her own composure finally cracking. "My tactics? My attacks? Chaka, you came on this show, you agreed to this interview, and now you're acting like I'm some kind of villain because I asked you a few challenging questions. This is what we do here. This is our job." "Your job?" Chaka's voice was incredulous. "Your job is to inform and entertain your audience, not to humiliate your guests. Your job is to conduct interviews with integrity, not to create manufactured drama. Your job is to treat people with basic human dignity, regardless of whether they're celebrities or not." The other hosts sat frozen, clearly wanting to intervene but unsure how to insert themselves into such a heated exchange. The audience, which had been murmuring quietly throughout the confrontation, was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Joy's face was now fully flushed, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from her animated gesturing. "You know what, Chaka? Maybe the stories about you being difficult to work with aren't just stories. Maybe there's some truth to them. Maybe the problem isn't everyone else. Maybe the problem is you." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Even Joy seemed to realize she had crossed a line. But it was too late to take them back. Chaka stood perfectly still for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression. The anger was still there, but it was now controlled, focused, and somehow more powerful than when it had been raw. "Wow," Chaka said softly, shaking her head. "There at Island. The real reason I'm here. You didn't invite me to talk about my music or my career or my new projects. You invited me here so you could try to tear me down on television, so you could validate whatever preconceived notions you had about me before I even walked through that door." Joy tried to interrupt, but Chaka held up her hand. "No, you've said enough, more than enough. You've shown your audience exactly who you are, Joy. You've shown them that you're willing to attack a guest, to try to humiliate someone who came here in good faith, just to create a moment for your show." "Chaka, you're being ridiculous," Joy said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "This is just a conversation that got a little heated. It happens all the time." "No," Chaka replied firmly. "This doesn't happen all the time. Professional interviewers don't attack their guests. Respectful hosts don't try to embarrass people on national television. Good journalists don't make up their minds about someone before the interview even starts, and then spend the entire time trying to prove their prejudice is right." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Chaka wasn't finished. "You want to know what's really difficult, Joy? What's really difficult is sitting here, maintaining your composure, while someone systematically tries to destroy your reputation and your dignity on live television. What's really difficult is being professional when the person across from you has no interest in professionalism whatsoever." The studio had become a pressure cooker, and everyone could sense that something was about to give. Chaka looked around the room, taking in the faces of the crew, the other hosts, and finally settling her gaze back on Joy Behar. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable finality. "You know what, Joy?" Chaka said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience dealing with people who underestimated her. I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is more interested in creating controversy than having a genuine conversation. And I'm too old and too accomplished to sit here and let you continue to disrespect me for the sake of your ratings." Joy's eyes widened slightly, perhaps finally realizing that she had pushed too far. "Chaka, please, let's just calm down and finish the interview. We still have your new music to discuss." "My new music?" Chaka's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Now, you want to talk about my music? After you've spent the last 20 minutes questioning my professionalism, my relevance, and my character? After you've implied that I'm difficult to work with and past my prime? Now you want to give me a few minutes to promote my album like some kind of consolation prize?" The other hosts exchanged panicked glances. One of them cleared her throat tentatively. "Maybe we could take a quick commercial break and reset." But Chaka shook her head firmly. "No, there's no resetting this. There's no coming back from what just happened here. Joy made her choice about how she wanted to conduct this interview, and now I'm making mine about how I'm going to respond to it." Joy's voice took on a pleading quality that was almost desperate. "Chaka, you're a professional. You know how television works. Sometimes interviews get contentious, but we work through it. We don't just walk away." "Don't I?" Chaka asked, raising an eyebrow. "Don't I walk away when someone treats me with blatant disrespect? Don't I have the right to remove myself from a situation where someone is actively trying to damage my reputation for entertainment value? You seem to think that because I'm a celebrity, I should just sit here and take whatever abuse you want to dish out." Joy's face was now red with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "It's not abuse, Chaka. It's journalism. It's asking the hard questions that need to be asked." "Journalism?" Chaka's voice rose in disbelief. "Joy, you wouldn't know real journalism if it bit you on the behind. Real journalists do their research. Real journalists ask thoughtful questions based on facts, not gossip and innuendo. Real journalists treat their subjects with basic human dignity, even when they're asking difficult questions." The camera operators continued rolling, knowing they were capturing television history in the making. The director had long since abandoned any thought of cutting to commercial, recognizing that this was the kind of raw, unscripted moment that would define the show for years to come. Joy made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Look, Chaka, I apologize if you felt disrespected. That wasn't my intention. Why don't we start over? We can talk about your music, your tour, whatever you want to discuss." Chaka stared at her for a long moment, and in that silence, everyone could feel the weight of the decision being made. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but absolutely final. "Your intention? Joy, your intention was crystal clear from the moment I sat down. You had an agenda, and it wasn't to celebrate my career or discuss my music. It was to try to make me look bad on television." She paused, looking directly into the camera for the first time during the entire confrontation. "And you know what? I'm not going to participate in that. I've worked too hard and come too far to sit here and let someone tear me down for cheap entertainment." Joy's voice cracked slightly as she made one final plea. "Chaka, please don't do this. Don't walk off the show. We can work this out." Chaka turned back to Joy with an expression that mixed pity with resolve. "The time to work this out was before you decided to ambush me with personal attacks. The time to work this out was when you chose to be respectful instead of controversial. The time to work this out was when you remembered that I'm a human being, not just content for your show." She moved toward the edge of the set, her posture straight and dignified despite the chaos swirling around her. The production crew scrambled to figure out what to do, some reaching for their headsets to get direction from the control room, others simply watching in stunned silence. "Chaka, please," Joy called after her, now clearly panicking about the implications of losing her guest in such a spectacular fashion. "Don't leave like this. What am I supposed to tell our audience?" Chaka stopped and turned back one final time, her expression now mixing sadness with disappointment. "Tell them the truth, Joy. Tell them that you invited a guest onto your show and then spent the entire time trying to humiliate her. Tell them that when someone pushes back against disrespect, you call them difficult. Tell them that you're more interested in creating drama than having meaningful conversations." Joy's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words but couldn't find them. The other hosts sat frozen in their chairs, clearly out of their depth and unsure how to salvage the situation. And maybe, Chaka continued, her voice carrying a note of genuine sadness, tell them that there's a difference between asking tough questions and being needlessly cruel. There's a difference between journalism and tabloid gossip. There's a difference between creating compelling television and simply being mean. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the studio floor with measured, dignified steps. The cameras followed her movement, capturing every moment of what would become one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. Joy made one last desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. Well, there you have it, folks. Sometimes our guests can't handle the heat of real conversation. Chaka stopped dead in her tracks. Without turning around, she spoke loudly enough for everyone in the studio to hear. The heat of real conversation? Joy, what just happened here wasn't real conversation. It was a calculated attempt to embarrass and belittle a guest for entertainment value. And the fact that you're still trying to spin it as my failure rather than acknowledging your own behavior tells everyone everything they need to know about your character. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Joy seemed to realize that her attempt to have the last word had backfired spectacularly. Chaka resumed her walk toward the exit, her dignity intact and her message delivered with unmistakable clarity. As she reached the studio door, she paused for just a moment, looking back at the chaos she was leaving behind. Joy sat at the table, her face a mask of barely controlled panic and embarrassment. The other hosts looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. The crew stood frozen, unsure whether to keep filming or cut away. And then Chaka Khan, the Queen of Funk, the legend